Welcome to Saltwells National Nature Reserve, one of the most impressive national treasures that we have in the UNESCO Global Geopark for the Black Country. And Saltwells has a number of these wonderful rock faces, and each one of these is a little bit like a window on the ancient conditions of the planet. It's like looking back in time. The detail and the features we see in these rock faces build up the story of how this Black Country landscape was built. So we're going to have a look a bit more at the detail of these things and build up that story in the next few clips. So every field trip starts with a meeting at the car park, and this is the car park at Saltwells. Saltwells is a geosite within the Black Country UNESCO Global Geopark, and it has formalised trails, and you can download these as a PDF on the website. But our journey will begin along this geo trail, and it'll head up into the woods just over here. So our first introduction to the concept of the geopark is at this site here, where we've got our first sign and interpretive totem. Our journey moves on along the trail towards the largest excavation in this geosite, which is called Dalton's Clay Pit, which is just up here. So this is our first view of the Dalton's Clay Pit, an open cast excavation where we can see a large rock face in the coal measure strata of the Black Country. Okay, we're going to go further into the woods to the viewing platform, which gives the best view of Dalton's. And again, another view of the scale of the open cast workings that were here once. That took out a vast amount of material to get at the coal, and in particular here, the fire clay resources at the base of the coal field. Okay, this is the main view overlooking the clay pit, and here you can see we've got some sculptural interpretation, a sign for the geopark, which tells us a little of the story of this wonderful area. So here we are, we can see a rock face exposing a series of bedded layers of rocks. A dark stripe at the top is the heathen coal, and above that, where the tree line is, used to be the thick coal that was completely mined away in the early 1900s. Move on from there and go actually down into the clay pit, where we can get an up close and personal view of some of the detail of these rock faces. And you can see that we've got some sculptural interpretation that links the modern wildlife here, the life of the present, to some of those ancestors, particularly the giant meganeurid dragonflies that used to occupy the swamps in which the coal seams formed. Okay, we're getting down towards the base of the clay pit now, and you can see there's a series of dipping layers. And we are going to go to a rock face that is just around the corner there, where we'll start to tell the detailed story of the Saltwells geology. And here we are at our first rock face within Dalton's Clay Pit, where we can get to see some wonderful geology and begin to build the picture of the ancient conditions of the planet as represented by the rocks here. Okay, so this rock face is at the base of an excavation called Dalton's Clay Pit, and it is within a series of rocks called the coal measures because they contain coal seams. This is not a coal seam. You can see it's a yellow sandstone and it has lots of undulating layers. It's in fact an ancient river channel that flowed here about 310 million years ago, and you can see from the different layers within it, it was not a simple deposit. It was a complex deposit built up of surges of storms and lower flow regimes. The detail of this is part of a much bigger story. So here we can see the bottom of a river channel that flowed across a mud flat. The rocks surrounding us on the other exposures here are full of clay, and that's why this was a clay pit that Daltons operated in the 1800s, and their cutting away of the landscape exposed the story below. So let's go and have a look at a couple more features now. Welcome back. We are now just around the corner from the rock face that we started at, but here you can see the layers are not nice and horizontal. They're actually tilted down into the earth, and that's telling us a few things. It's telling us that the earth has moved around a bit, that plate tectonics has thrust up the landscape and the rivers have dried away, but it's also giving us clues about the kind of landscape that sits below this whole area, where the rocks dive down towards the east, towards the city of Birmingham, and that as we go in that direction, the layers that stick out at the ground will be the ones on top, so they're younger than these. So when we go in that direction, the layers that come out from the ground, that hit the ground at the surface, are older, they're below these. So on a simple rock face like this, we can start to see the Black Country landscape has been moved around by big earth movements a lot in the past. These rocks are about 310 million years old, but the rocks below that come out of the ground over there are much, much older. So we are returning now to the main path out of the clay pit up that slope, but we're going to make a slight detour over there to the corner where you can see the brown stain on that little rock face within the vegetation. That's where a spring line enters this pit and is one of the reasons why this whole area is known as the Saltwells. We are still in Dalton's clay pit, towards the base of the clay pit, and here you can see that the rocks yield water. In fact, the rocks down below are quite different to the ones we saw on the other side of the clay pit, which were full of sand. These are clay, and so the water sits on top of them until it comes into that junction with the sandstones, at which point it forms a stream coming into the pit. And you may have wondered why this particular geological site is called Saltwells, and that's because the stream here that's bubbling into the pit is very slightly salty, and a little bit further back in the woods in that direction was an actual brine well that was pumped for medicinal purposes, and we'll have a look at that later. So what we've actually got in this clay pit is the very base of the Black Country coalfield exposed. The arching up of the rocks means that the basal layer of the entire coalfield, which goes in that direction away from us, is exposed here. That's extremely special, because that base, these river channels, sit on an older landscape, a landscape that was built here before and was lifted up as these rocks were arched up into this fold. So what we have here is an extremely special set of rock faces that tell us not just the story of how the coal seams were formed in this swamp with these river channels, but an older landscape that sat beneath that long, long ago. Okay, so that was Saltwells and the excavation that holds some of the really lovely coal measures exposures that we have here in the Black Country. But our next part of the journey is into much older rocks, and to do that we have to turn about face and go along this track here. This will take us up towards a canal that was the main transport system for the minerals from this particular excavation area. Here we are, and actually we'll stop on the way because we've been doing a little bit of industrial archaeology. We've been excavating one of the old engineering buildings, so let's tell its story. We're still at Saltwells, we're in the woods, and occasionally when you're wandering through the woods and on the trails, you come across a gem of industrial archaeology. A little bit of a clue to human activity in these woodlands in the past. And believe it or not, these walls and this concrete floor with a hole in it were part of the mining operations here. This was one of the engine sheds which had a steel cable ropeway. The notch there in the slab is where a large winding wheel went that took a cable up the slope and took tubs full of mineral from the clay pit up to the canal just at the top there, which is where we'll go next. Okay, moving on from there, we'll continue up what was the old mineral railway to have a look at the next set of rock exposures. So now we're coming to the top of the mineral track, which leads us to a set of exposures on the right hand side that we call the Tramway cutting. These are exposures of quite a different set of rocks, so let's take a moment and tell their story. Now we've moved from Dalton's clay pit up the hill very slightly towards the canal, and what we are standing in here, as you can see, is an excavation in a trench-like form. And this was where the old mineral railway ran. We call it the tub line or the tramway, and this cutting through the rocks here exposes something quite different. The rocks still have the dip into the ground that we saw a little bit further down in the clay pit, so they're still tilted over by earth movements. But in this case you can see they're thin, uniform, dark greenish grey layers, and when you look very closely you can find shelly fossils from a shallow tropical sea. So these formed in a completely different environment to the ones just down the way in the clay pit. Here they formed under a tropical sea, down there they're formed in a swamp near the equator. So these are much older too, they're about 420 million years old, and we can see the junction at the next stop just up by the canal. So this is Netherton Hill. We've just crossed the road onto the other side where we can follow the tramway. Okay, we're now going to go down through this gate, follow onwards on the geotrail along the remainder of the mineral railway, the tramway section, to look at the next suite of rocks. As we come along here we'll see there are some recent exposures. These have been cleared by our volunteers and our wardens, and actually in doing this on the side of this extension of the tramway we've not only discovered an extension of those rocks we last looked at in the tramway, but also over here in this corner we have something quite different. We can see the layered rocks up there give way to a fractured and massive darker brown suite of rocks here. What we've got is a contact zone there, and we'll talk a little bit about this rock on the left a little later on our tour. But for now let's rejoin the main path and continue on the main journey. On our right here we have another one of those windows that we've recently cleared to take a look at the underlying rocks, and the rocks that were at the side of the old tramway when this was a mineral railway. But we won't pause there on this occasion, we'll go on to the Dudley No. 2 canal, which is just ahead of us. Okay, so what we're doing now is effectively standing in what was the canal arm. These blue bricks mark the edge of a canal arm that came in from that direction. The tramway came along through this fence on the top of this flattened area, the edge of the canal that was right in front of us here, and tipped them over to the left into the waiting canal narrowboats that then exited in the direction we're facing onto the main canal. We'll have a look at that now. As we're coming along here, again we can see another little window we've exposed in recent months, which shows more of that massive dark lumpy rock rather than the nice layered sedimentary rock. So let's continue towards the canal. Okay, down the steps we come to the Dudley No. 2 canal. This was one of the main thoroughfares for the mineral wealth of the Black Country. As we turn to the right we're going to enter what was once a tunnel through the hill, a canal tunnel through the hill called Bruins Tunnel. And when we get to the far end of that, we'll stop and we'll have a look at a very, very special exposure of rocks indeed. And so we come into the Bruins unconformity, this really important geological section just on our right here. And what we can see, what I hope you can see on this video, is that there are finely layered reddish tinge rocks. These are Upper Silurian red Downtonian. They're, as you can see, very friable shales, and they give way to slightly more coarse material. And then suddenly, right at this point here, we can see the rocks change. They become full of pebbles. They contain very large pebbles in places, and slightly above this very coarse grit conglomerate we actually find small coal seams. A clear indication that we've changed from one environment to another. So let's tell more of the story of that one right here. Welcome to Bruins Canal cutting. The rock face here and the Dudley number 2 canal were once a tunnel. It was called Bruins Tunnel, and it cut through the side of the hill to keep the canal on a steady level. The rock face here is extremely special. It's a treble SI, a site of special scientific interest and national treasure. And the reason for that is because this site is where we see the older rocks down here. The pale rocks here are Silurian period in age, 420 million years old. Coming up above it, we see pebbly rocks, yellowy sandy rocks. That is literally the first layer of the Black Country coalfield. This is the contact of the base of the newer rocks, 310 million years old, sitting directly on top of the marine shales, those shallow sea shales of 420 million years. So here I can put my hand in the ancient seas and the swamps, and between my hands is 120 million years of Black Country history that's been eroded away by time and weather patterns between the two. Then the whole lot has been tilted up by massive earth movements to create this upfold, this arch in the hill that creates Saltwells National Nature Reserve. So we're coming back to where we joined the canal. On the left we'll turn, but just before we do that, there's another really quite significant rock face that we cleared recently, that Alan and the volunteers here made accessible through creating a path, and that's this rock face right here. So let's stop and talk about what this tells us about the ancient conditions of the Saltwells area. We are literally at the other end of the Bruins Canal cutting, the Bruins Tunnel entrance as was. And behind me you can see another rock face. But this rock face is not the same. As you can see, it isn't tilted over in the same way it was just along there. And you can see the rocks here don't have nice layers. They're all lumps and bumps and fractures. And that's because this dark, hard rock behind me is called basalt ore. In this case, a bit coarser than that rock called dolerite. And so this is the same as the rock you get at Giant's Causeway. It's a molten rock that's come from inside the earth and been squeezed up a large crack, a geological fault, that runs through this end of the tunnel. And it's put a sheet, a wall of this really hard, igneous volcanic rock from deep down in the earth as a barrier across this side of the hill, which is why they originally dug a tunnel. They weren't sure how thick this layer was going to be and how hard it was to connect the canal through the hillside. When they hit this sheet, they drove a little tunnel through and found that it only went a short way before they went into the softer sandstones and shales that we've seen further along the cutting. So this is another episode in the history of Saltwells, where the landscape has been torn apart by earth movements, a crack has formed, molten rocks from deep in the earth have squeezed up the crack and formed a sheet, a volcanic dike that we call it, running across this landscape. So that is the final part of the story until man got here and created the canal and the mines to expose all of this and bring the enlightenment of the ancient worlds through to the present day. Okay, so we've come back to this point. I promised you more of the story of this particular contact. So now we know that this lumpy mass on the left here is an igneous intrusion, a sheet of magma that was injected here about 307 million years ago, and it actually is in contact with the sedimentary rocks right there. And these sedimentary rocks are yellow sandstones. It's the Gornal Grit, or the Downton Castle Sandstone Unit, which marks a change to more terrestrial conditions right at the end of the Silurian period. This is 307 million years old. That's about 419 million years old, and the contact between, because it's against a sandstone, shows very little contact metamorphism other than a few gas bubbles within the sandstone, which formed presumably as a result of hydrothermal activity at the moment that the dike was injected into this fracture. Okay, so here we are back at the car park, but this time we're going down to the Saltwell, which is just down here. So just down here in the woods behind the pub the Saltwell's Inn is a little bridge across a stream called the Black Brook, and this is the site of one of those really curious stories about the whole of the Saltwells area, because here just at the side of this stream 100 years ago, there goes a heron, down here you can see just the remains of a wall just below the bridge there, and that was once a building that was a bathhouse for the Saltwells. So let's tell that story now. And our final stop on the tour is right by the side of the Saltwells Inn, down in the Blackbrook Valley, and the water you can hear is the stream that runs down off Netherton Hill and eventually joins the River Stour down in Cradley. So why are we here? Well, this again returns to that story of the salt wells. The salt well itself was literally where we are now, just to the side of the stream. It was a borehole that pumped brine water from below, warm brine water, and it was used on this location for the treatment of all kinds of ailments, from bad spots to, it's claimed, leprosy, could be cured by taking of the waters of Saltwells. But probably the most curious part of the Saltwells Spa story is the fact that an eminent chemist from Birmingham had the water tested and found it to be as efficacious as that from either Cheltenham Spa or Leamington Spa. So the Earl of Dudley at the time came up with a plan that the small nearby town of Netherton could become the Black Country Spa town of Netherton. Now, as it happened, the mine waters that were being pumped out of the mines drained that water table down, and the influx of fresh water, because of the movement of water through the mining systems, diluted that salt to a point that it's a very low salt content now. So that plan never fully achieved its potential ambition. But I still love the thought that Netherton could have been the Cheltenham Spa of the Black Country. Let's go back to the point of origin of our story today, and we'll just do a little roundup at the end of our field trip. So here we are back at the car park and our point of origin for this field trip. But it's not the end of the story. This little building site in front of us here is where, in the very near future, the new Warden's Base and the Visitor Centre for Saltwells National Nature Reserve will be, and the onward story of the surrounding geopark and the coalfield. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this trip and that you will join us in the future for real to experience not just the Saltwells but the whole of the Black Country coalfield around it as expressed through the Black Country UNESCO Global Geopark. So for now, thanks for joining us and a safe onward journey.